George Siemens is a prominent writer, speaker, and researcher in learning, networks, technology, and organizational effectiveness in digital environments. He's the author of Knowing Knowledge, an exploration of the context and characteristics of knowledge, how knowledge has changed and what it means in organizations today, and a recently released handbook on emerging technologies for learning. He's also with the Technology Enhanced Knowledge Research Institute at Athabasca University. I've followed George's work for years, and the thing that's always impressed me the most is his ability to stay involved and open along the whole spectrum of higher education. He can be equally found discussing corporate governance, social justice, consulting in ed tech, or running a massive open online course. I'm very happy that he's been able to come out to our beautiful campus today on such a beautiful day. Thanks for bringing the weather, George. I appreciate it. Was that Alec? I'm not sure which. It was you. So thanks for coming.
Check to see if mic's on. Good. Well, first of all, it's unusual that Dave would introduce me in a polite way, so I'm more shocked than anything else. That's why I had to write it down so it didn't reduce into a usual squabbling. But thanks for the opportunity to be here today. It's definitely it's my first visit to Prince Edward Island, and when I received the invitation, it was a great honor to come down. And I certainly want to extend a thank you to the individuals that were involved in that and the organizing committee as well. I want to talk about a few things today, some of which are going to be at a level that will probably be above, in terms of strategically or international trends, above current action levels. So what I mean with that is we'll look at a few of the trends in higher education, and you might look at that and say, well, that's very nice, but what do I do differently in my own work here on campus? So we'll definitely have some sections in there, but I think it's important to lay that foundation, because the concerns around education, this concept that was mentioned of the consciousness of change, I think that's critical. It's critical to understand that some of the changes we're facing are of a significant scope. They're of a foundational nature. So I want to particularly talk about 5 key areas, some of the current states and developing trends, how higher education's role is changing in society, particularly then how society and the university is responding to those changes. Then I want to look at the role of technology in the process, and this is where I'll probably offend a few of you. I'm increasingly comfortable with my growing technological deterministic outlook on life, and so there will be those of you that will completely disagree with me, but I just want to let you know in advance that you can start disagreeing now. And then I want to talk about how we're going to, as a university or as a society, start to integrate knowledge, learning, and technology. So for starters, let's look at some of the current trends. UNESCO Higher Education Report, and there's been a flurry of these that have been released over the last several years by UNESCO, World Bank, OECD, and other groups that are international organizations are really trying to make sense of, we know something is happening, but we just don't know quite what it is that's happening, and even worse, we're feeling powerless in the sense that we don't know how we ought to respond. You read the odd article or you see the odd TV program and it talks about the death of the university. Universities will be obsolete. And yet some of the stats we'll look at, they seem to indicate the exact opposite direction. And so it's tough to gain a sense of, should we be giving all of our students iPads when they come on campus and let them run through meadows of open learning, or should we pursue a more rigorously instructional design model? So there's a lot of hype out there, and there's not really a whole bunch of clarity. But what we do know, and this is what's coming out from some of these larger governmental organizations, is that we do need to reorganize or review or revise our capacities for accessing and benefiting from high-level knowledge. And this is high-level knowledge that's changing the economy of society. Now, if we take a quick step back and we look at what's the scope of universities, if you look at your far left, you'll see the number of learners enrolled in higher education around 1970 sat under 30 million. And then we look at today, it's higher now, but around the 2007 level when this particular stat was released, we were looking at about 153 million learners participating in higher education internationally. So this doesn't really look like a system that's on the verge of complete implosion, at least if you follow the trend lines. You might argue, well, it will implode precisely because of sustained growth, but at this point at least that's a tough argument to make. And it's even tougher to make that argument when you stop and look and say, well, what are the countries that are just now getting onto the education circuit? We're talking China, India, and much of Africa, never mind Brazil, and some of the South American countries. So we see an enormous increase in higher education literally around the globe, and some of the areas that still have the largest populations, such as Asian countries, Latin American countries, those, even though they comprise by far the larger portion of the population of this particular graph, they represent a relatively small portion of the overall educated or the overall participants in higher education. Now, the difficulty coming out of this, and this is, institutions aren't blind to this at all, is that we're going to need new revenue streams that aren't going to be based on equities. You remember those wonderful things that the endowments that Harvard universities and others had that was going to be their future, and suddenly it imploded, and you had universities like Harvard and universities across Canada laying off faculty, tenured faculty, because they simply hadn't found a model that would be successful for long-term growth perpetuation. Now, the university, or the Ontario Online Institute that's being proposed, and others that are pursuing this particular track, are recognizing that you're going to find revenue from a few areas. One is research commercialization, and we've been pursuing that for well over a decade in most university systems. But the one that everyone's really excited about is all those wonderful international students, because surely they will be our saving grace. And that's the mindset that at least is being adopted by the Ontario Institute. And if you look at it, Canada does have a fair bit of room to grow in this sector. Right now, you're likely aware, but Australia's largest export before its current mining boom, which, we'll see how it turns out, but right now their largest export is international education. Even though, and this is one of the fickle natures of this, because the Australian government sort of reduced the pace of visa requirements, they had a 40% drop in international enrollment students this last quarter. So it's a fickle economy, and we're not quite sure how it works yet. But if you look at Canada, we have 5.1% of the international education market, even though we have a population that's probably about 30 to 35% higher than Australia. So Australia has done a far better job of tapping into international students. So these are still on-campus students. This doesn't include the prospect for online learners as well, which I assume will be quite a bit more in number over time as well. Now, the neat aspect, though, is in light of this need, we need new models for commercialization or for revenue growth from the university sector, because it is pinched. But we have a reduction in overall government commitment. In a lot of cases, government commitment from the 70s on, sitting at around 80%, is now down to below 60% of the total operating revenue for a university, whereas tuition, which at one point was sitting under 20%, is now approaching the 40% level for overall contribution to the Institute's operating revenue. And yet, in society, we're entering a period where traditional sector jobs are largely in decline, and what's called the creative industries or creative fields are largely increasing. And, needless to say, this is reflected as well through global economy as well. The United States, which has remained reasonably stable, and yet the advanced economies have progressively dropped, and emerging markets are increasing at a significant pace. In light of that, the economy around the world is largely moving toward a knowledge-based economy. You've heard that term many, many times. But this is a report that came out of the Martin Prosperity Institute called Ontario in the Creative Age, and it's based on some of the work of Richard Florida. They were looking at what's going to happen in terms of employment options in the future. And by and large, the areas where employment options will increase, and for that matter are continuing to increase, relates to something in the creative-oriented sector. Now, creative-oriented means something where you use critical and creative thinking skills to address and solve novel and continually changing problems. So that's essentially a mindset of what creativity is in this scope. So the economy then, that was based perhaps in the past, my parents certainly were in this field, and I suspect some of yours as well, was more of a physical labor, or what's often called a routine work field. And those, as evidenced by the recession this last time around, you saw fields that were classified as routine labor, experiencing dramatic double-digit levels of unemployment, and fields that were defined as creative service or creative sector fields were actually, in some cases, growing. Now, that might have been due to enormous investment, government investment, because that's typically where you're going to see some growth in those kinds of fields. But nonetheless, unemployment in those sectors fared much better than they did in the routine work fields. So that's a quick landscape look at where the university sector is right now. Or society is as a whole, and how this notion of education access, a creative-based economy, changing global structures economically is coming together to impact the university. And I've just put together a quick image of some of the trends that are coming out of this. And I should mention, if any of you are interested, because I'm sure when you go home tonight you'll say, wow, that George guy, I really wish he was here with me now talking to me some more. You can go online to slideshare.net. /G Siemens. And I have the slides there if you'd like to look at any of the stats or the resources that I'm using here. They're in the footnotes of each of the slides if you'd want to access the reports directly. Anyway, so this is the change structure then that impacts the society or the university culture as a whole. And this is based on a UNESCO Trends in Global Higher Education report. And so I'm just throwing out a few of these rapidly. And I won't go into great detail on these. I suspect you're likely familiar with these. I'll start at the bottom right, national competitiveness. I'll address this in a few minutes as well, but universities are being seen no longer as places of education, but as places of innovation to sustain and to perpetuate an economy within a particular region. This is why Africa is having such a difficult time gaining a foothold in this market, because when their students are educated, they export their students, because they haven't been able to create an appealing knowledge infrastructure for their educated graduates. Even in places in South America, for example, a respected university professor will often pick up an evening job as a taxi driver in order to make ends meet because of the low pay for that particular sector. So national competitiveness is tied to the university sector, which is why universities are not going anywhere. Internationalization and globalization, I'm sure you've heard about this enough because we've been talking about this for years, but from a truly pleasant capitalist perspective, it's been stated that universities, higher education is the last major economic sector to be globalized. And it's in the process of being globalized now. If you look at the Laureate Group, recently announcing Bill Clinton as an honorary chancellor within their organization. They run Walden, they're a several billion-dollar-a-year revenue group, University of Phoenix, which is owned by the Apollo Group, again, a several billion-dollar revenue-generating system, random point of information. The Laureate Group receives, or is the number one recipient of government-funded medical research in a country like Chile, for example. They're not just for-profit the way we see them. They have numerous physical campuses around the world, and they're participating in government-funded research. And that ties directly into the private for-profit sector, the growing massification of education. If you look at some of the stats, Canada right now has the highest level, tied with Israel, participation in education, in post-secondary education as a country, approaching about 45%. So we have a very highly educated workforce, but it's been stated, and the Canadian Council of Learning in a report about 2 years ago for their annual State of Learning in Canada stated that 2/3 of all new jobs that will be formed within 10 years will have a requirement of an advanced education degree. So there's no reason why we won't see continued increase in that sector. The only thing we won't see, though, is that sector will provide how would you put it? It won't be provided the way we provide it today. Hopefully you won't have to gather in 10 years' time in one space and hear me talk to you. Quality, this is an increasing concern because quality and accountability, this is one of the, you can hate it all you want, and I suspect many people do, standardization, testing, and all those things, but the more our society becomes technological, the more it becomes technique-driven. The more it becomes technique-driven, the more we will appeal to standardization. So that's an inevitable reality, and there's quality structures that are going to be created around that, and they already are based on some of the work that's being done by UNESCO and other organizations. The last 4 points I'll run through quickly. Research and commercialization of research is a huge revenue opportunity for universities, but it's far harder to do than it actually sounds like, because in many cases, when I was at University of Manitoba, we commercialized, if that's the term to use in this instance, several pieces of software for curriculum mapping. And lo and behold, after 3 years of aggressive selling, you get a check for $200. So, it's not exactly a utopian world that's coming there yet. Economic trends are reshaping higher education as well. Increasingly, and this is a typical function of recessions, enrollment goes up, but unfortunately, the case in this particular recession, funding goes down dramatically in many instances, or due to plunges in endowment funds, you have a negative equity ratio, and then you have to make up for it somehow. And then the final points relate to technology, the growth of technology. It's roughly everywhere, and it doesn't seem to be going away. I'll make a bold prediction and say a year from now, you will use more technology in your daily lives than you're using today, and that trend will continue in the foreseeable future until we merge and become one with the machine, and then it won't matter anymore. And the final point relates to access and equity, because that's a big concern, and this is the goal of open universities. And definitely, I think part of the intent when you're talking, from the campus to the country, this is what we're looking at, is how do you give anyone, regardless of their position and geographical location, equitable access to education opportunities. And as the President mentioned in the opening section here, there's no reason why any region in the world that has foresight and vision can't be on the leading edge, because certain needs for physical locativeness are reduced in a technological or digital era. So you have companies like BioWare coming out of, everyone knows the #1 gaming mecca in the world, Edmonton, because you don't need to be located in a particular space to participate in a knowledge economy, because the information interactions are much more fluid. Okay, so that's the backdrop. The changing role of education, like it or not, I don't like it, but this is the reality. The role of university is shifting from producing better citizens to producing a better economy. And this is nearly universal. And yes, we'll lament about the decline of humanities, and I'm sure you're aware, I've heard about universities in UK, for example, cutting philosophy departments because it's not seen as being economically as valid as science and technology initiatives. University of Prince Edward Island recently received an excellence research chair, which, as I'm sure you're aware, are well-funded, and with additional revenue spin-off and local government commitments, apparently turns out to be about $27 million a year per person, not 27 million over 7 years when you add the local government contributions. Look at the list of people who are on there. I don't see a lot of philosophers in those research chair positions, and I don't see a lot of English majors in that. Now, there's issues with that. I'm not comfortable with this shift, and the other thing to note as well is do a quick tally and have a look at female representation in that particular list. That should be another disconcerting element. Nonetheless, whatever your views are on this, this is the reality. This is what's happening. This is the role that education is playing in society. It is less concerned with the generation of moral members of society and more concerned with the generation of economic value for a particular system. And in all fairness, in spite of ongoing growth in revenue, the current university model is increasingly unsustainable, because the quantity of funding, and it's much easier, as I'm sure presidents and others are aware, it's far easier to get funding for a building than it is to maintain that building and ongoing effort and continue to keep the campus current. I mean, that's one of the intentions behind KIP funding this past several years, or last year, I guess, really, with the Government of Canada. Other systems, such as University of California, is experiencing dramatic reduction in funding because they're simply not capable of funding the university at the level they did when the economy was growing. So right now there are sectors that are laying off, definitely in the U.S., really across the board, and it's a rare day where I don't encounter some kind of a report of 15 tenured faculty being dismissed, or this university is shutting this down. There was a period when we had the high fuel prices. There was talk about going to a 4-day school week and shutting down the universities on Friday to reduce energy costs. So we're very much at a point where this let's build new buildings so that we can get more students is not a sustainable model. And now, of course, a new building is far better for the ribbon cutting for local politicians, admittedly, than a new rack of servers in the back of an office that you're going to use to run a new online course. But the reality is we do need to rethink a few things. I'll talk a little bit about how specifically society and the university are responding to some of these changes, some of these trends. This notion of world-class university has been put forward for quite a few years, and it's been suggested by individuals and really countries. World Bank is one of the leading participants in this concept. The person who created this particular image here, Salmi, actually has produced a report on building world-class universities for the World Bank. And the critical element here, and this is something you may have read last year, a year or two ago it should be, there was a group of leaders with Canadian universities, and at that point I believe it was University of Toronto, University of Alberta, and UBC, and they said, fund us better than you fund the other universities because we need to be world-class universities. And there was obviously a bit of concern because this tiering of universities threatens in particular to drop out that middle sector, right? The small, low-cost universities that are locally based, they'll probably have a reasonable future. In spite of what happens, the top-tier universities will likely have, due to reputation and access to international scholars and international networks, they'll likely continue to be okay, but there's that whole mid-sector of universities that's very worried about what their future will look like, and admittedly, they are the most vulnerable. But this particular image, what I want to emphasize here, this is this notion of a world-class university, but essentially the concepts, I think, are the same for any university system. I'm just trying to bring together a few of these key elements, in particular the emphasis on technology. But you do need some kind of abundance of resources. Now, these are often, your left, these are often related to budgetary resources and grants and opportunities, whether it's collaboration with corporate entities or even, for some case, the generation of revenue. You need a concentration of talent. Students, teaching staff, researchers, all those other wonderful things that come with it. And that, of course, brings in this notion of graduates and quality of research output. And then you need favorable governance, which was a point that was mentioned earlier. One of the three key elements moving forward was the importance of leadership. Now, just underneath the dark circle in the center, there's this notion of technology transfer. And that's essentially, it's increasingly a muddying term. It's anything from knowledge mobilization to technology transfer to commercialization. These terms are all starting to bleed into each other's territories. But essentially, you have a model for a university system to be effective. And in my assessment, this would be regardless of whether it's a physical campus, such as UPI, or a virtual campus, such as Athabasca University. For these systems to be effective, you do need this particular combination of access to resources, you need the concentration of talent, and you certainly need favorable governance. And in this case here, because of the focus of this day and tomorrow, I just want to particularly draw attention to the fact that, I'm sure it's not happening at UPI, but most university systems that I encounter, there is a distinct lack of strategic thought on the role of educational technology in the system, and I think that's a bit of a risky approach because of the lack of sustainability of existing university models and the need to draw on additional revenue sources through international students or through reaching the full spectrum of your learner base, such as you've already addressed with the from campus to country attitude. So my critique typically would be directed toward the governance concern because we're building a system under an ideology that's fundamentally changed in society. And I've made this statement in the past, but each era creates institutions and systems that reflect the ideologies and the concerns that are prominent to that era. What inevitably happens, the eras change, but because we're so good at making systems, they don't. So eventually, as time moves on, we get an institution that's no longer properly aligned to the needs of society. Frank and Gabler addressed this particular concern in their text, Reconstructing the Universe. And they emphasize that universities map the reality of the society in which they exist. And as knowledge institutions, they're doing that to less and less a degree, especially when you start to see open educational resources, this concept of do-it-yourself university, which is a peripheral element. I don't think it's central, but it's still worth recognizing that it is there and is its concern. Now, a few ideas have been suggested on what does this mean. If you're going to have these world-class universities, what does it look like? And we start to get into something that looks like a triple helix. And this is a model that's been put forward where university, government, and industry play together in loving, warm embrace. The reality is, of course, there's a lot of concerns with that. And as you can see, and I hope some of you are agitating and getting progressively more irritated as I speak. Maybe it's just the droning nature of my voice, but whatever it is that's getting you irritated, particularly I'd like you to be irritated by the almost deterministic nature and the utilitarian focus of education that's coming out. And I'm presenting it that way intentionally because there's a dramatic concern here. I've already tried to address briefly, but we're seeing universities as a utilitarian entity. We're not seeing them as a system that's structuring and contributing to the moral fiber of a society, if you will. But nonetheless, I'm just giving you the current thinking and the current trends that are going on, and you can decide how and if you wish to respond to reject those. So just stepping back, that's a triple helix model. We'll revisit that again in the last section when I start to tie some of these ideas back to a PEI context. So how are some universities or how are organizations and society responding as a whole to address growing complexity, reduced funding, this concept of world-class university, the fact that we now have an information flow society where knowledge is, to many perspectives at least, the critical entity around which we build our institutions and around which we interact. So there's numerous approaches going on, anything from partnerships, this notion of globalized universities. Some are extremely unsuccessful, like Johns Hopkins' attempt to enter the Singaporean market and the failure with the university system there. There's others that have been no, reasonably successful is perhaps too strong to say yet, but there are certainly some Middle East universities and attempts there to partner and export primarily the American university model, because it is without a doubt the most successful in the world. In spite of growing reductions in overall production of scientific papers, the United States still produces about 35-37% of academic papers in the world. So needless to say, they're definitely still the big entity. In fact, it's the most secure aspect of the American system right now. Then you have alliances, which are increasingly prominent as well, a combination of private sector and international alliances trying to focus on and start to create integrated systems of knowledge. And this only makes sense, right? Because we don't need to be geographically confined anymore. Right? We can interact with individuals and researchers from around the world. Now, most of you think, well, duh, that's decidedly obvious, George. I've been using Skype for 6 years. But for a lot of faculty and university sector, it's not duh. The thrill of Skype. I recently had a Skype call with someone from a university in the southern states, and they were thrilled that they could use Skype. So I emailed and said, can we just meet on Skype rather than a phone call? And he emailed me back the next day and say, wow, this Skype is a cool technology. Let's try this. And so for some of you, you've been on Skype for an awfully long time, so you don't see it that way. I'm just trying to emphasize, perhaps your comfort with technology is advanced from what you see throughout the system of universities as a whole. So these alliances, these international organizations that are primarily digital or network-based are still quite prominent. Consortia obviously continue to be a part of it, distributed research labs, for-profit, the growth of for-profit sectors. University of Manitoba, where I used to be, obviously our continuing education, our extended education faculty had a cost recovery model and contributed fairly significantly to the university's operating revenue as well. So it does have a slightly different slant in some cases than a traditional university faculty might have. And needless to say, you may have heard about the University of California, the Law College at Berkeley, where they're experimenting come fall of this year with about a $5 to $6 million investment in fully online courses at the undergraduate level. The assumption being that prestigious elite universities can still dip their toes in the muddy waters of online learning and remain holy. So, that's an interesting development there to see those kinds of universities realizing, due to financial constraints, because they're driven almost exclusively by finances, due to an enormous operating cut. Of course, you've read about the Excellence Research Chairs. I love this quote in Globe and Mail this morning, actually. It said, if you read the British press, you'll see they are screaming bloody murder that we're taking away the best from Britain and bringing them to Canada. And he seems somewhat incredulous, like, well, precisely. That was the name of the game. And it is the name of the game, because if knowledge is the core concept around which we center a society, we will begin to treat knowledge the way that a society has treated other value assets in the past, such as land or minerals or those kinds of things. Namely, we'll go to war for those, not necessarily in a traditional sense, because now we can just have drones killing each other off, and it's really just an expenditure in, tech investment. But the reality is we will pursue with equal vigor the knowledge-based economy that comes out of it. So it's not surprising that Canada is aggressively pursuing these researchers, and it's not surprising that UK is offended that they're losing those researchers, because that is the premise. As the quote here states, that is the name of the game that we're in. The Ontario Online Institute, in the last provincial report, Government of Ontario said, we really do want to have the kind of economy that is globally recognized for innovativeness. And we want to make more money because we want more international students. Hence this concept of an Ontario Online Institute. Unfortunately, they didn't fund it at all, which is a bit of a drawback, but their intention is they want to explore what an online institute would look like, and they recognize that this really is where things need to go. Now, universities like Athabasca, who coincidentally are in consultations with the Government of Ontario, but universities like Athabasca find this a bit disconcerting because our primary draw of learners does come from Ontario. In the same regard, when I was at University of Manitoba, we had more master's level nurses enrolled in Athabasca than we had enrolled at our master's program at University of Manitoba. So this online medium does make a transition or a shift in terms of the quality of education or the accessibility of education. Okay, so we're seeing universities changing. well, we're seeing society change. We're seeing the role of education in society change, and we're seeing that universities are attempting to respond through really a variety of ways right now, trying to move to the online environment, trying to create new alliances, trying to create new relationships with other institutions. It's, in a sense, a bit of a chess game to make sure that your institution is properly positioned to respond to what's becoming less of a geographically related world and more of a knowledge-driven society. And what's the role of technology in all of this? And I'm sure most of you have agreed with everything I've said so far, but here there may be a small point of departure. First of all, it's just a tool, right? We've all heard that. That's what technology is. It's just a tool. Well, I have a dramatically different stance. I had to throw in the tricks rabbits, just in case anyone didn't get it, but anyway. In my eyes, technology isn't just a tool. It's a means of transformation. And if you see it as just a tool, you overlook the fact that it's becoming a cross-disciplinary resource. In fact, one of the aspects that I'm seeing more and more across university spaces is that people with the technology skills, particularly or ideally with a blend of pedagogy/technology, there's a cross-disciplinarian aspect to the university now where they're able to sit down and chat with a group of chemists about how they ought to teach chemistry, and chat with a group of people in physics, and chat with a group of people in education or nursing. And there's a commonality that's educationally or educational pedagogically driven. And if you've been in a university teaching services, and I'm not sure what you have to a particular center that addresses that here, you'll likely realize that that feels extremely unfair because you've spent years improving quality of teaching and developing teaching dossiers and encouraging faculty to improve the quality of their teaching. And then all of a sudden some yahoo hangs up a shingle and says, we have Moodle, and they have a line out the door with people wanting to get involved in using Moodle or whatever system it is that you use. And this seems very unfair but the reason is because technology is cross-discipline and it impacts virtually every aspect of the university in terms of delivery, but not just delivery. You're starting to see now the joys of Twitter recruiting and Facebook recruiting, and I'm not sure what your marketing and PR department does for you in terms of social media presence, but that's where these kinds of tools are increasingly being used. So it's not just educationally. It's also communication with your potential audience, but it's more than that as well because it's also becoming about managing institutional knowledge. So like it or not, we are centering on technology as a nexus point for effective university functioning. Initially, yes, it was lovely systems that would allow us to track student enrollments in our financial systems that would give you extra hours of training so you could figure out how to enter a simple bloody invoice that used to have one box to enter. But that's all changed now, and it's now beginning to influence the system of education itself. And in some regards, there's this concept of a new affordance of technology. Typically, as I was told by Dave, this is where people would get booed when they say affordances. But affordances I look at coming out of Gibson's work on the action potential of a tool or the action potential of a particular resource. In and of itself, it does have certain characteristics, but it's what it enables that makes it particularly valuable. What can we do differently now that we have this particular tool at our disposal? Or what can we do differently now that we have Moodle on campus, or now that we have blogs, or you're using Drupal, or whatever it is that you're using? What can you do differently? And for that matter, what has technology invalidated? Which of the views and the ideologies that UPEI was founded on have been invalidated by technology? I mean, courses. Do we still need courses? Perhaps there's a better way to organize knowledge than courses. Do we still need to all be together in this room and have someone lecture at you when it's like 24 degrees in here? There's questions that you can ask. What about textbooks? Or the shape and the role of libraries, or even physical journals, open access journals. Should you even be publishing in journals that are closed? I mean, these are the kinds of questions that are worth asking because unlike something that would be a tool that you would just apply to a particular task, technology as an ideology transforms the system within which it is utilized. Now, McLuhan was always able to reduce concepts to little, silly terms, but this notion that, first we use the tools, then the tools use us. Well, I think in terms of education, that's precisely what's happening, is there is some change of routine and mindsets that were valid in a technological era, but have been reduced or somewhat invalidated to where we are today. The example I love about this is the work of Paul A. David. And he responded to a quote you may have heard it that stated, we see computers everywhere except in the productivity statistics. That was a quote from the 80s, I believe. And the assertion that this individual was making, you know what, you've got computers in every office, every business, but it hasn't produced the productivity ratio of America. Now, what David did is he took a look back at major technological advancements and looked at where was there a dramatic shift. How long did it take for that innovation to become systematized, to become structurally embedded? And he looked at the dynamo, the electrical engine. The illustration he found with that was when the electrical engine was first invented, it was primarily brought into existing multi-story factories and dropped in the basement to replace the engine, coal, steam, diesel, I don't know what was there before, but the electrical engine was first used to replace the engine that existed before. And for a long time, there was heavy investment in bringing these engines in, but no structural change to the manufacturing sector. Years later, to the tune of 30 to 40 years later, I would argue close to where we are now in the computing field, the tool changed the entire system. The dynamo changed the production line, created the production line, enabled the production line, and altered really everything that happens in terms of manufacturing. In a similar sense, for a lot of years with technology, it's been really about, in classrooms at least, it's been about let's have a computer here and let's get an LMS set up over here, and we'll take those course notes that I have and I will put them into Moodle. What a clever idea. But we'll still teach the same. We'll still have a course. It'll still be X number of credit hours. It'll still have a start and a stop time. It'll still be structured with the prof as the center of the course experience. And that's not necessarily bad, but there are other ways to augment that. So the point David came to was that changes that are revolutionary in nature are revealed not by the pace of change, but by the breadth and depth. And that relates to the innovation clusters that spin off around it. So it's not how fast does something change, it's how deep does something potentially change. And this certainly was the case with the dynamo, and we could argue whether that is the case with computers. All right, so I've got about, as I understand, about 20 minutes or so before we move to Q&A. So I think I'll finish off at least on time, maybe even a bit earlier. But I'd like to look a little bit now about integrating technology, knowledge, and learning, and what exactly that might look like. First of all, I'd like to emphasize a few illustrations where this has been ongoing already. These are either governments or school systems or members of society that have invested dramatically at a strategic level. Not at a sort of an ad hoc, let's plug something here, let's plug something there, and that are trying to take advantage of this so-called knowledge economy. First of all, there is the Netherlands, who's been one of the more effective participants in this era in terms of their ability to nurture innovation around technology, much like you're starting to see universities starting to tie into startups and getting connected to startups, seeing the activity of being an entrepreneur as being a key academic activity as well. So that integration is similarly being evidenced with the knowledge infrastructure in countries like the Netherlands. They've invested heavily, and now they're starting to reap the benefits of this. And their realization, much like, and I'll jump down to the third one, much like Saudi Arabia, but the realization is, as a country that's based on an energy sector, their energy revenue will run out eventually. Except for the oil sands. We'll be there for a long time. Anyways, so these energy sectors will eventually have issues, and they need to create a different economy. It's tough when you're in Saudi Arabia, for example, to create an economy when your primary resource is sand and sunshine. And so that's, of course, gross generalization, but nonetheless, it works for now. So what they did in Saudi Arabia is they invested $30+ billion into the university sector to literally, from ground zero, create an internationally recognized university system. And they've attracted some prominent researchers, paid them extremely well, and they're on the way, at least they're hoping they're on the way, to reposition the economy because their current economic model is not long, or doesn't have an extended life the way they would want to be a long-term successful country. You have other areas such as Athabasca University, TECRI, and the Alberta government. that's recognizing that the interactive sector, those technology and interactive fields, everything from gaming to e-learning to whatever else is involved, forms a critical pillar of the Alberta economy. Now, Alberta is not unlike Netherlands necessarily in that they do have limited resources that will eventually run out, and they've invested heavily in nanotechnology at University of Alberta, wind and energy and other systems, and there's growing interest in saying we need to rethink our economic structure around what does it mean to interact in digital environments, because it's not just a learning function. It is, to a degree, but as learning becomes more distributed, namely, we don't have a course as our model of learning, but we have lifelong learning, we have, porous classroom walls, and we don't have age-based learning the way we've perhaps had in the past. I'd be interested to see your institutional statistics on this, but when I was at Red River College over the short period, I was there for about 10 years, we had a steady increase in the average age of our learners each year. And even now, university systems, their average learner is no longer this so-called, I just got out of high school and I'm 20 years old and trying to get a degree. They've now become individuals who may be on a second job or career, or they may be upgrading or whatever it is. But the profile of a student in a university is quite different now than it was even 15 or 20 years ago. So when you have these systems that start to change, and education means something different than it did in the past, and learning means something different than it did in the past. Because your parents, my parents, theoretically, would go to school to get a job, right? I mean, that was the intent. So here's my education part of life, here's my working part of life. You do one, finish it off, you move on to the next. And I think for probably everyone in this room here, that's likely not the way it is anymore. Now, admittedly, you're in the knowledge sector, but even people who are in more routine-based work have continual upgrade and knowledge needs. I have a brother-in-law who works in heavy-duty mechanical field, repair work, and he's going constantly on week-long excursions, I would say probably 3 to 4 times a year, because something new has changed, the technology has advanced, the repair work has changed, so there's continual ongoing upgrading. So in a learning and knowledge sense, and I think I can't make a direct comparison between Netherlands and PEI or Alberta and PEI or Saudi Arabia, but I think you can get a sense that there is an economic restructuring. Deloitte's Center for the Edge addresses this under the umbrella what they call the big shift. Type that carefully when you're searching for that. Anyway, so there is a restructuring economically that's happening in this sector of society. And the Deloitte Center argues again that you need to foster these ecosystems of innovation, because Prince Edward Island as a sector will transition, maybe not to the same scope that other regions might, but certainly has the potential, because geography is less of a limiting factor in this particular space. Needless to say, delivering simple opportunities for education to participants that are located in rural areas is obviously one of the first opportunities, I think, to embrace. But any society economically eventually benefits from a highly educated population. A couple illustrations from university sectors that are starting to do this well, that they're starting to pull together learning and strategy execution. MIT has done this quite well under their Knowledge Research Center. And what they've managed to do is basically create a knowledge technology learning structure that creates and generates its own research, its own tools, its own software that then are applied in university settings. This is why, was it last year, I believe, that MIT announced that they were discontinuing first-year physics lecture classes, because first-year lecture classes are much like you're feeling right now. There's limited value sometimes in those experiences. They would much rather engage and interact with other people. And so they've changed to a lab-based setting for first-year courses so that they have that learning opportunity. At University of Queensland, actually Queensland University, the Center for Educational Innovation and Technology serves a similar role. It was funded, they actually drew one of the individuals from MIT out there, funded to the tune of, I think, $25 or $30 million, and their whole role as a research institute is to begin to interact and intersect with the other sections of the university in such a way that they can create technology that's innovative, not strictly serve the needs of the university sector, though that's vital, but actually push the pedagogical boundaries of a university sector by innovation in the technology spaces. And perhaps the best model I've looked at is the Karas Institute that comes out of South Korea. I don't think I've ever seen a country or a region that has done a better job of creating a fully integrated learning, knowledge, technology structure than Keras has. Now, I saw one of their promotional videos, which was kids going to school and loving how much they could learn with technology, and then going home with great glee in their hearts to sit down on the computer and continue learning for hours. That may have been propaganda, though. But what they did do very well is they managed to present, based on the profile of your learning activities, they managed to present you with resources that you needed rather than sort of this structured learning mindset. The view I often have on this is, the efficient market hypothesis, if you have an economics background, is this notion that markets are rational and that people are rational. Hence, you can model them and you can say, if person A has 10 of these and person B and C each want 6, there's going to be an escalation in cost, right? It's this efficiency metaphor where the players are rational actors and we have rational outcomes, and there we go. Now, most economists, especially after 2008, would question the efficient market hypothesis because there's these messy little entities called human beings that we bring into the market equation, and they do things that you can't produce in a model. They have things like greed that goes on, and that produces outcomes that a model doesn't anticipate. I think in education, we have a similar problem. We have this efficient learner hypothesis in education, right, that says all learners come into our graduate, undergraduate courses with this as a knowledge base. If all we do in our course outlines put a little line that says this is a prerequisite and then you'll do okay in this course. There's this mindset that all of our students come into our course at a set stage, we push them through, we give them the set outcome, and voila, all learners have learned at the same level, yes, different grades, and away we go. But it doesn't work that way because people come into our university sectors with a dramatically different knowledge base. And one of the key research areas that we're exploring at TechRE is exactly on that topic of personalization adaptivity, because a course construct of learning that does not account for personalization is not a long-term approach. Learners are too varied and too unique in the university sector, even while it pursues outcomes or competencies, whatever makes your people happy, can still personalize and adjust the process to get to that outcome. But in the process, I think it's important to question this efficient learner hypothesis because it's simply erroneous. I had a learner, and I've mentioned this in the past, but he slept in his car for the first month and a half of his college education. Now, I taught him just like I would any other learner in the classroom, but do you think for just a minute maybe sleeping in a car influenced his ability to study? Grades. I mean, it's for economic reasons that he was sleeping in his car, but I think that's kind of the reality that we need to recognize is our model of pushing content out is a sort of a hangover of our intoxication with instructional design. Keras somewhat challenges that, and Keras calls into question that notion and begins to add technology layers to improve the quality of that learning experience and to customize it to individual learners. So here's what I would suggest is the single greatest challenge that faces universities and colleges today, especially those that are aspiring for relevance in either their region or participation in larger structures. But that's some kind of strategic integration of learning and knowledge in relation to technology that generates some level of capacity for innovation. I just put words together that sounded like I could write it in a government document. So I think I did pretty good with that one. But no, the real intent there is saying, how do we innovate through our learning and technology structures? Because, as I stated earlier, you will be using more technology a year from now and even more a year after that. There's really no necessary end in sight right now. And the sector, the role that universities are being asked to play in society is innovation-driven. And this is increasingly, it has in the past, I think, come from a grassroots model. And it's now moving towards more of a systemic change, or at least should be. This gets back to that governance model that I mentioned in the first slide. So for the opportunity then is how do you create and foster a policy or a strategy that integrates the faculty, the learners, the technology, and the knowledge, and not just knowledge that we push out. Too often in university, the conversation is, we assume that our learners are the only ones learning, and yet we have this enormous amount of organizational knowledge that we somehow need to be able to find and be able to connect with, whether it's a social networking service that you run within your institution, or whether it's a knowledge management system, whatever that means to you, whether it's a content management system, but managing those resources well is important for competitiveness and to reduce inefficiencies in education as well. This particularly comes in line with this notion of analytics, because we are doing a pretty decent job of collecting data now. Most of your LMS systems are putting out some level of information, but right now, students with their little iPhones and their conversations on Facebook and participations on Twitter and whatever else are generating a fairly consistent flow of data. And especially those of you that are in this room that are active in those services, I could find out information about yourself that you might not, or find information about you that you might not be aware could be discovered, because, this is my argument anyways, it's not knowledge that's power, it's the ability to integrate knowledge across spaces that's power. And this was the whole reason why Poindexter's attempt at total information awareness right after 9/11 was to reduce the silos between government entities, so that your doctor could find out exactly what your driving record is, and your insurance agent would know what your whatever is, so that you would basically dissolve the data silos and allow a government to have total information awareness of its members and its citizens. So, educationally, and there's huge privacy issues around that, but we'll let our kids figure that one out. So for now, let's just collect more data. But what's happening is there's predictive analysis that comes out of this. And there's huge value in this, because your students, and if you're familiar with work around this concept of honest signals, we foreshadow many of our decisions well in advance of actually making them. So a student that's going to drop out of your course foreshadows that typically before he or she drops out. A student that is going to drop out of a program similarly provides indications. There are key structural support periods where you can contribute to assist a learner's success, and if you fail to contribute to their success, could well be contributing to their failure in that particular course or program. So the assertion, and this is something EDUCAUSE and others have put this forward, but better analytics equal increased learning success. We ideally should know where our learners are at on a fairly regular basis and the outcome of those activities. And just for a random point of information, any of you are interested on this subject, we're organizing an event, I believe it's end of November, December, around learning analytics in Calgary. So if you're interested, let me know and I'll keep you informed. Now, in spite of this, or in light of this, we have this system of analytics growing in prominence, and we have the value of higher education as a driver of economic development that's put out by the Rockefeller Institute. It becomes increasingly important that governments get better at managing data, finding data, collecting data, and integrating that across its various silos. This is a list of data sources that are being generated by Stats Canada. It gives you a bit of a sense of what kind of data landscape we have access to, but unfortunately it's not well integrated. It doesn't provide you with an effective illustration of where education is in Canada. That's why you supposedly have to bring out people from other areas who may or may not be experts to tell you things that, because you should be able to access the bulk of this information in one central space without a lot of the headaches. Technology should provide the integrative sense-making feature that we currently rely largely on people to do for us. That's a controversial statement. But in terms of UPI and economic development, once again, you start to look at what are some of the ways that you can better leverage your education, technology, knowledge infrastructure in the service of the region in which you exist, but also to go beyond that, to bring together startups, incubator models, the entrepreneurial approach to learning, the adoption of a triple helix model, which to varying degrees most universities have some relation to already. Because right now I'm going to assume, this is how technology usually evolves at a university. Someone has an idea, maybe they go to a conference or whatever, and they encounter something neat, a neat tool or something else, or maybe they just played around with their spare time. And they come back to the university and they say, can I do this? And the first response is no. And then they say, okay, well, I'm going to just run Blogger on my own. Or, as I've seen in numerous universities, I'll set up a server in my office, and I'm going to run WordPress MU out of that, and I'll just teach this way, whatever else comes with that. You'll have other faculty that will come along and say, I think I'd like to try clickers in my classroom. And you don't have a strategic, systemic approach to utilizing clickers or perhaps even experimenting with it, which in some cases could be okay. So they'll go out and they'll play around with clickers with a group of 20 or 30 students. Someone else will come along and they'll say, you know what, I'd like to try a GPS experiment with my students. And so now you have these little pockets of innovation popping up all over the campus. And the only way you know what's going on is if you have a person that you can go to. You can go chat with someone like Dave who will have a sense of where technology is. But let's say Dave gets hit by a bus, and suddenly that knowledge is gone. So that's not an effective model in the long run. You want to become better aware of your technology utilization and who's doing what and where, because there's a real issue if you agree with my assertion that the effective experimentation and utilization of technology and knowledge and learning is a key foundation for creating the future economy of PEI, then you would say it's perhaps quite important that we start to become more intentional with our technology utilization. We don't rely on, I've got a server under my desk, model of technology adoption. I think it's a great model, but we're getting to a point, and that was a good model 10 years ago, but I think we're getting to the point now where the governance structure of university has to recognize, wait, this wasn't just a group of people who are randomly bored doing stuff on their spare time. This is a critical piece to the future success of the institution, and we need to become much more experimental and much more intentional on this process and how it is that we actually roll this out. Unfortunately, if you're looking for support broadly, there's a bit of a limited aspect of this in Canada. We don't have a national e-learning strategy. Even countries like UK, while we're stealing some of their top researchers away, they'll go back eventually because we don't have an e-learning strategy, I'm sure of it. So there's definitely a need for universities to create those infrastructures on their own in partnerships with other entities. Unfortunately, once again, we don't have a national system that permits this kind of discourse and this kind of discussion, particularly related to strategy and policy. So the challenge is we do have a strong foundation of technology in Canada at least, and most would recognize this. Some would acknowledge that Canada is falling a bit behind in the e-learning scope over the last few years. But by and large, we have an excellent sector, an excellent base in place. Unfortunately, too many of the mindsets and the practices that are in place now that were based on supporting a model that perhaps isn't as relevant now as it was 20 or 30 years ago around learning and education is now a key challenge, because that's a dominant limiting factor, I think, in terms of your capacity to innovate. I'm going to leave it there and pause for questions.